Welcome to training presentation for Standard 4. My name is Roman Polechenko and I am Assurance Manager at SBP. I will guide you through the Standard 4 version 2. I expect that you completed previous modules about Standard 1 and 2 as it is important for understanding how the Standard 4 works and how it relates to those other two standards. In this session, we will give you a detailed overview of the Standard 4, its purpose and contents. We will link it to the guidance document and focus on indicators that are new or revised and might require more time to implement. I will pay special attention to the mass balance requirements. Let's start. So what is the purpose and scope of Standard 4? In short, it's a chain of custody standard. SBP Standard 4 sets out the principle and criteria that organizations along the supply chain must follow to trace and account for the purchases of SBP compliant and SBP controlled feedstock and biomass. SBP Standard 4 is used by organizations in the biomass supply chain to have confidence that the biomass purchased with SBP claim has originated from sourcing areas where the risk of non-compliance with Standard 1 or 2 is low. Previously, version 1 of the Standard 4 relied heavily on chain of custody requirements of FSC and BFC certification systems. The Standard 4 itself did include very few requirements. This was not ideal for the number of reasons, including challenges with following the changes in other system requirements defined in applicable requirements where FSC and BFC cover more products than just biomass, and many requirements are not relevant for sustainable biomass, and also FSC and BFC chain of custody systems were not compatible with the mass balance rules of RED 2. A decision was made to develop a self-sufficient SBP chain of custody standard. FSC and BFC chain of custody standards were used for inspiration and all relevant requirements were included in SBP Standard 4. We adopted the traceability concept of mass balance known from RED 2, which accounts for certified volumes purchased and sold. It is used to ensure that certified organizations do not sell more certified biomass than the volumes of certified biomass or feedstock purchased. The publication date, effective date, transition period are the same as for other standards. Before I start explaining management system requirements, it is worth mentioning that Standard 4 version 2 does not require a certificate holder to be certified against a previously called SBP approved chain of custody system and to hold a valid certificate for FSC or PFC. In other words, holding FSC or PFC chain of custody certificate is not mandatory anymore. For the same reason, all relevant chain of custody requirements, including the quality management system requirements, are now included in SBP Standard 4 itself. All requirements listed in Section 1 are to be included in the organization's management system. During audit, the auditor will verify that the management system and performance conforms to the relevant standards. SBP requirements for management system follow conventional chain of custody systems and should be very familiar to all relevant stakeholders. There are a number of examples chain of custody procedures available online. For this reason, I will focus only on a couple of new indicators, which are stakeholder engagement and business integrity. So, we have a new requirement for stakeholder engagement, which includes identification of stakeholders and creating the stakeholder engagement plan. As defined in glossary, a stakeholder engagement plan is a procedure that outlines how and when relevant stakeholders will be identified and contacted, what information will be shared with them, and how comments, feedback will be received, reviewed, addressed, and responded to. The intention of stakeholder engagement is to demonstrate a commitment to being open, transparent, and responsible with regards to conformance with SBP requirements. Stakeholder engagement plan can help organizations identify the most critical opportunities for collaboration, improvement, and risk mitigation to address broader challenges in fulfilling the commitments in each context. The plan applies to all operations concerning the organization's chain of custody, including operating sites, business offices, and scope of their certificates. It is applicable to all certificate holders, regardless whether they or not an organization complete supply-based evaluation and is certified to Standard 2 feedstock verification. So in other words, this requirement also is applicable to biomass producers without supply-based evaluation, to also traders and end users. Note, if the organization is certified to Standard 2, the stakeholder engagement plan could also include the requirements to engage stakeholders specific to the supply-based evaluation. Similarly, if the organization operates another stakeholder engagement program, the stakeholder engagement plan can be merged with it as long as the requirements defined in the standards are covered and complied with. Stakeholders from following groups would be appropriate: timber processing industry, provincial and federal government authorities, indigenous people, non-governmental organizations working in the environmental and social sectors, industry associations, associations of forest owners, certification bodies working in the forestry sector, and customers. A comprehensive list of stakeholder groups to be considered in the stakeholder engagement plan can be found in the SBP Regional Risk Assessment Procedure, Annex 1. A complaint procedure is a part of the stakeholder engagement plan and is conventional practice for organizations implementing certification. It can only serve its purpose if it is effective in practice. The complaint should be applicable to the organization's conformity to the requirements applicable to the scope of the organization's SBP chain of custody certificate. For a complaints procedure to be effective, stakeholders need to know about it, have confidence in it, and be able to use it. Poorly designed or executed complaints procedure, or ones that are difficult to find, can risk complaints among stakeholders, further causing distrust and disrespect of the process. Any person or group or entity that is or likely to be affected by the organization's activities should be able to assess the organization's complaint procedure. So these stakeholders include, but are not limited to, customers, suppliers, workers, local communities, other parties related to chain of custody, but also stakeholders with complaints in regard to the supply-based evaluation, feedstock sourcing, and other elements relevant to the organization's certification scope. The requirement 1.15 of the standard provide minimum requirements for a complaint mechanism, but there are a number of good resources available on the internet. So we discussed the stakeholder engagement plan, and let's spend some time discussing the business integrity, quite significantly revised requirements. So first three requirements in these sections are about legality of all operations, anti-corruption measures, and occupational health and safety. This requirement is meant to ensure that the organization implements the policies and procedures required by the requirement. On top of that, the organization should complete a self-assessment in which they describe and present documentation demonstrating that they have implemented measures related to the requirement, as well as any available information regarding the effectiveness of these measures. Another new requirement is a self-assessment and statement against social requirements listed in Standard 1, Criterion 4.1. We remember that Standard 1 applies to feedstock, but it is also important that the organization itself follows the same principles within its own operations. This requirement is meant to ensure that the organization implements the policies and procedures to ensure that decent working conditions are provided and labor rights are safeguarded for the organization's own employees and within its own operations. Each organization should complete a self-assessment in which they describe and present documentation demonstrating that they have implemented measures related to the requirements, as well as any available information regarding the effectiveness of those measures. Organization could develop a new or use an existing statement with regards to working conditions and labor rights. This statement demonstrates its responsibility, commitment, and expectations for respecting human and labor rights. Please go to the guidance document to see much more details on this topic. So, section 2 is about sourcing. Organizations shall maintain up-to-date records about all suppliers who are supplying material used in SBP product groups, including names, material supplied, and certification codes where relevant. Quite clear and straightforward requirements. The feedstock inputs for production of SBP certified biomass shall be categorized as follows. SBP compliant, so the feedstock sourced in compliance with SBP Standard 1 and/or 2, and SBP controlled, the feedstock source under the SBP recognized controlled claim. We learned from Standard 2 module that SBP compliant biomass may be produced using the supply-based evaluation against Standard 1 by sourcing processing residues with SBP recognized certification system claim, or by sourcing post-consumer feedstock and complying with Annex 1 of Standard 2. SBP controlled biomass can be produced by sourcing feedstock with the SBP recognized controlled system claim or by downgrading the SBP compliant claim to SBP controlled claim. Next section, section 3, is about material handling. Let's have a look at mixing options here. So intent of this requirement is to ensure that SBP feedstock is not physically mixed with non-SBP feedstock. SBP does allow for mixing of SBP compliant feedstock and controlled feedstock. If any non-SBP feedstock is mixed with either compliant or SBP controlled feedstock, the entire mixture loses the status. When SBP compliant feedstock is mixed with the SBP controlled feedstock, the proportioned method should be applied. Alternatively, the whole mix may be classified as SBP controlled. If your organization chooses to implement either of these separation methods, physical or temporary, to ensure that SBP and non-SBP feedstocks are not mixed, detailed documented procedure should be presented to demonstrate how the separation is maintained during the feedstock receiving, storage, through the whole biomass production process. Physical separation means physical segregation of products. Temporary separation means products are processed at different timing, in sequence, for example. SBP certified biomass, compliant or controlled, shall not be mixed with non-SBP certified woody biomass at any point after the biomass production. For example, traders at the wood pellet storage facilities may not mix SBP compliant or controlled biomass with non-SBP biomass. Mixing SBP compliant and SBP controlled biomass with woody biomass that is not SBP certified, for example, physically mixing SBP compliant with FSC certified biomass, let's say in harbor storage, this shall result in losing SBP claim for the whole mix. SBP compliant and or SBP controlled biomass may be mixed with non-woody biomass. In this case, the amount of SBP certified biomass shall be proportionate to eligible input. Section 4 is traceability. It covers input purchasing, material counting, mass balance, output sales, and claims. So, input purchasing. This section requires that all transactions of material included in the SBP product group schedule can be traced at least one step upstream and one step downstream from itself, and that all material is accounted for whilst under the legal ownership of the biomass producer. So the organization needs to record its suppliers and customers at minimum. Biomass producers with supply-based evaluation will, of course, need to have a deeper traceability back to the forest. But this one is handled in Standard 2 and it will depend on the risks identified. Standard also includes a list of information to be provided by the supplier for the supplied material. Organization should implement appropriate control mechanism upon reception of goods. Organization needs to ensure that feedstock conforms with all applicable requirements in Standard 2. It may be the supply-based evaluation using SBP recognized claim for processing residues or demonstrating post-consumer status of the feedstock. And lastly here is the organization needs to define the reference to link the physical material to the DTS transaction, which may be the order or invoice number. Next subsection is about material accounting. Firstly, it requires quantities of input and output to be tracked and to be reconcilable. Secondly, the conversion factor needs to be calculated and correctly applied. The use of conversion factor should ensure that feedstock group and other attributes of the biomass output align proportionately with the feedstock inputs on a dry weight basis. The organization must define and record the methodology for calculating the conversion factor and keep access to the records used. The determination of the conversion factors must be based on actual production data and records, including determined and undetermined losses, which should also be recorded. Then there is also a requirement about so-called double counting. This requirement is inspired by FSC and PSC chain of custody standards and is meant to prevent double counting of sustainability claims across voluntary certification schemes and may require organization to operate a combined mass balance or credit ledger depending on the schemes to which it maintains certification. Please go to the guidance document for more details and examples on this requirement. Finally, there is a requirement that organization trading biomass without physical possession and without mixing, like traders or mobile shippers, shall not utilize mass balance material accounting system, but instead should use a separation system. So we got to the most exciting part of the chain of custody standard, which is mass balance system. Most biomass producers will want to mix various feedstocks and will apply a so-called mass balance methodology. For organizations opting to use the mass balance system for material accounting, organizations shall set up and maintain a mass balance account to which additions and deductions of eligible input for a single physical site shall be recorded. As we discussed already, a conversion factor shall be calculated and applied. The mass balance shall be calculated per product group. We will cover product groups in the next slide. The mass balance time period is defined as maximum 12 months. However, due to additional restrictions in RED 2, this period is only available when the biomass producer uses exclusively primary feedstock, like for example a wood chipping company with physical chipping site. If biomass producer uses processing residues, post-consumer feedstock, or is a trader with a physical site, the maximum mass balance period for all product groups is limited to 3 months. The mass balance shall be calculated separately for each site and legal entity. So-called cross-site credit approach like an FSC system is not allowed. In certain cases, organizations' mass balance may temporarily show negative balance for some product groups, or either imbalances between the characteristics of biomass produced and sold. This is permissible so long as any imbalances are resolved within the defined balancing period so that the characteristics of biomass produced during the balancing period align with the total characteristics of biomass sold and are carried over to the next balancing period. So temporarily the minus can be, but by the end of the balancing period, everything shall be in plus. A positive balance may be carried over in the account into the next fixed balance period, up to the total corresponding amount of physical material that is in stock at the end of the balancing period. One more requirement is that the organization shall make available to the certification body all mass balance data in advance of the planned audit. Before we check the example of the mass balance, we need to say a couple of words about product groups. SBP Standard version 1 had a concept of the dynamic batch sustainability data, or DBSD. The DBSD is used for accounting for the Dutch SD plus claims and categories. Since DBSD was only used for Dutch claims, then some of the data was dynamic for some markets, for example SD plus category 5 or Flanders restriction claims, but static for other. SBP Standard version 2 introduces the change that sustainability data is dynamic for all transactions. To achieve that, and when the organization is a biomass producer, it shall categorize product type, for example wood chips or pellets, into product groups for the purpose of mass balancing and controlling claims. Each product group may include one or more feedstock groups, and we will cover this in Standard 5. As a minimum, the biomass producer shall create separate product groups for each product type, which are pellets and wood chips, and assign a unique 2-digit product group ID under the following feedstock classification rules. So the list is forest feedstock, trees outside the forest, urban and landscape feedstock, trees outside forest, agricultural land feedstock, processing residues feedstock, and post-consumer feedstock. Such approach allows sustainability data to be dynamic with every transaction. So if end user receives a transaction with the product group ID 5A, it knows that corresponding amount of pellets was deducted from the mass balance account for processing residues feedstock. Data in this R report only complements it with the more specific details on feedstock origin, shape, moisture content, transport distances, etc. Again, we will cover this in the next module about Standard 5. You may be asking what letter A means. We will learn this in a moment. The decision to categorize biomass into additional product groups is optional. In most cases, biomass producer would choose to do this because of specific claim or reporting requirement of the regulatory market the biomass is being sold into. To determine which product groups to include in their mass balance system, the biomass producer should first start by determining the different types of claims or shipment levels reports required by their customers. Examples could be the need to avoid feedstock from certain country or follow special exclusions like stumps. A unique product group ID shall be assigned to each product group per the table here. If only the minimum mandatory level product group is used, then the product group ID, the letter A shall be just 0. So in case of forest feedstock product group, the ID would be 10 or 10. Each additional voluntary characteristic shall have a separate unique letter A number. For example, ID will be 1111 for forest feedstock from USA and 12 for forest feedstock from Canada, if this needs to be separately counted and created as a separate product groups. We will learn more about how this information is transferred through the supply chain in the module about Standard 5. On this slide, we see a simple illustration of the mass balance. Time period here is chosen to be 3 months, and it is dictated by the RED II mass balance rules that limit it to 3 months when feedstock is not only primary feedstock. The conversion factor is taken here 1:1 for the simplicity of the example. On the left, we see feedstock inputs divided by feedstock category. On the right, we have 3 separate product groups and 3 separate mass balance calculations. If there was any physical inventory before September, then it can also be taken into the mass balance calculation. In our example, we can assume that the inventory was 0. At the end of the mass balance period, the remaining physical stock can be moved into the next mass balance period, considering which balance wasn't completely used. For the sake of the example, let's imagine that the biomass producer has sold 300 tons of processing residues and 200 tons of tough agricultural biomass. The remaining physical stock will be 100 tons. These 100 tons may be moved into the next period as forest feedstock pellets, because this mass balance hasn't been used. If a biomass producer has the need to sell a big quantity of processing residues pellets, for example, so let's say more than they usually source during 3 months, it will need to accumulate this not just as a mass balance, but also as sufficient physical stock. So again, this is a big difference with the credit-based system, where you could accumulate so-called virtual credits, and it was not linked or dependent on the actual physical stock. In case of the new mass balance system we use in the standard version 2 and also RED 2, only what is physically in stock. This will be the limiting factor for transferring balance into the next period. When it comes to output sales, then the fundamental condition is that all SBP sales shall be registered in DTS system. Claims made outside the DTS system shall not be recognized. The value of the DTS system thus cannot be overestimated. There is a separate set of modules on how to use the DTS system, as well as we provide a detailed user guide for it. DTS transactions shall include a unique identification number, which allows it to be linked to the delivery documents. Appropriate reference system may be chosen by the organization. Usually it can be invoice, sales order, or waybill number. The last subsection defines the possible SBP claims and general conditions for their use. As we already know, there are two claims in SBP system, SBP compliant claim and SBP controlled claim. So that is it. Thank you for watching this module. You can now proceed to the next one about Standard 5.